theyeshiva.net.
Welcome back to another Thursday Night Live here on the Jewish platform. Few times in my life have I ever been so awestruck by just being in the presence of such a great man as our guest that we have tonight. And never have I had the privilege or opportunity to interview someone on this caliber. Let's welcome the amazing Rabbi YY Jacobson. Rabbi YY, how are you?
Wonderful, thank you, and I'm really pleased and privileged to be here with you. Thank you for your passion and enthusiasm.
Oh, Chasidus. Now, you give dozens of shiurim weekly to thousands of people, and few people, if anyone, gives as many shiurim on Torah and Chasidus, Chizuk, and Stam inspiration anywhere near the amount that you give. Now, we know it didn't start all of a sudden in 2020. There's a Rabbi YY. We have a picture actually going back to when you were 15 years old, I'm assuming in the 1980s. I know, I forgot what they called it, but you used to sit and listen to the shiurim of the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, and you had to memorize them. Let's go back. Let's hear, when did Rabbi YY and how did Rabbi YY become Rabbi YY? We're just going to put up that picture for you 1 second over here, and then you're going to tell us what's happening.
Der Rebbe hat angeheben, als ist doch mich Tarach bei Erev Shabbos, Echel bei Shabbos, ist der Erev Shabbos gewesen Yudzai in Tev Kislev, und danach geht man von dem rein in Shabbos, wo das ist doch Chai Kislev, Yudches Kislev, und Teke von Mayad Mitzay Shabbos ist Yutas Kislev, und das ist doch der Reish Hashanah auf Teres Achsidus und Daike.
And now you can tell us what's happening.
So my parents were born in the communist Soviet Union. They suffered terribly there as Jews, religious Jews, Chabad Chassidim. My grandfather was arrested, tortured. They made it out from there, B'chazdei Hashem, on false passports. They ultimately came to the United States of America, and they settled ultimately in Brooklyn. I was born in 1972. I grew up at the feet of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. And at a young age, I was privileged to be summoned to join the group known in Chabad as Chozrim. Chozrim is an institution that goes back to the Baal HaTanya.
Wow, that's over 200 years.
Over 200 years ago. Baal HaTanya became a Rebbe in Tovkuf Lamed Zayin. That's 1777. That's the time of the American Revolution.
Wow.
So we're dealing way before 200 years ago. And this was an institution. Since in Chabad, the focus was, they called the Baal HaTanya the Litvak. The students of the Maggid called him the Litvak because he came from the area of Litov, Lithuania. He came from Lyozhna, which is Belarus and Lithuania, right near Karlin.
Right near Karlin, right.
Which is also the Lita. I don't know if you know that the Hasidim in those years, a lot of them were called the Karliner, all of them, the Karliner, because Reb Aaron HaGadol of Karlin. So one of the institutions in Chabad was the Chozrim. Since the Rebbes would speak Chassidus ba'arichis at length, and elaborate and dissect auf ein Litvischen Steiger.
Right.
You see it in the Baal HaTanya's Shulchan Aruch Harav and his Kuntrus Achrons, but you also see it in all of his Maimarim and all of his Hasidic discourses. So there was a group of Hasidim who had great minds, who were charged with the responsibility to serve as human tape recorders.
Wow. To
remember and transcribe all the talks already of the Baal HaTanya. The Baal HaTanya had 5-6 people who would do it. We have, this is rare for a few hundred years ago, to have a Rebbe, a teacher of such magnitude, and you'll often have a Maimer with 6 different manuscripts because of 6 different people.
And were they trying to write word to word, Rosh Prakim?
That's a great question. So the Balatanya once spoke about 3 of the writers. And he said, my brother label, he had a brother label. Yeah. Schreibt, was ich sag. He writes what I say almost verbatim. Mein Sohn Berel, the Mittler Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe, schreibt, was ich mein. He understands what I'm trying to say, and that's what he writes down. Und mein Einer Kol Mendel, the Tzemach Tzedek, schreibt, was ich sag und was ich mein. He transcribes both. So he always had different talents. People obviously write the way they absorb it. You know, everyone has their own kishroinas, their own talents, their own unique way of chapping something. So this continued literally for more than 2 centuries. And by the most recent Lubavitcher Rebbe, when he became a Rebbe in 1950, that system continued. He would speak for Shabbos and Yom Tov for hours. You're talking about fabrengas that can go from 3 to 8 hours.
Wow.
Sometimes Yom Tov, let's say Shmini Atzeres Simchas Torah, there could be 4 fabrengans over 2-3 days, each one many, many hours.
Wow.
So from the first fabrengan already, 1950.
And it wasn't just speaking. I'm saying it was deep, my mora.
You could say that again. With the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I mean, the depth and the breadth was incredible. I mean, you can have a 7-hour fabrengan or a 5-hour fabrengan. There could be an hour shir in a Rambam.
Wow.
There could be an hour shir, a Siyam Masechta. It could be a Siyam on 4 Masechtas. Another hour dissecting a Rashi. Another hour a Sugya in Kabbalah and Chassidus. A Sugya in Hashkafa, education, current events, Nigla, Halacha, Rishonim, Achroinim, Machshava, Kabbalah, Musa, Chassidus, contemporary issues, psychological stuff, Teres HaNefesh, Avodas Hashem. And there was a tapestry of Mamash Kol HaTorah Kula, and often science and physics.
And they came, I believe, one after another. It wasn't just...
Yeah, and also the Rebbe wouldn't say a lot of jokes and stories. He didn't... So it was serious.
You had to keep up. It was a marathon.
It was intense. Very intense. And he would quote from Kol HaTorah Kula, and it was without notes. He didn't give before, the Mara Mekayma, so we could prepare the shir. And I remember at the end of I still remember the end of a fabrengan. You were like in a different world, like in a trance. It took time to land. So I had the schus from being of that group. It was a small group, and this was our responsibility to memorize and transcribe.
Wow, incredible. So at what age were you chosen to be from the Chayzrim?
So I have an older brother, Rabbi Simon Jacobson, who joined the groups of the Chayzrim back in the 70s when he was a yeshiva bacher. It started, the Rosh HaChayzrim is a Jew, his name is Rabbi YY Jacobson, who was actually a chavrusa with Rebel Povarsky from Panovich. The Haragorner Baruch Dov Povarsky, they were chavrusas back in the old days. Rabbi YY came to America, and from day one he became the chayzer of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he would bring in usually bachrim that he felt were skilled. So my brother was one of them. So when I was already pretty young, he felt that I had a skill.
You had what it takes to memorize a 3 to 8 hour mimer in who knows how many topics and say it over.
Well, I can't say that I can memorize everything, but I had Hashem has given me the gift to be able to be typhus, to absorb a lot of the Rebbe's words, at least to some degree. So there was usually one mimer. That was the part of the Fabrengen that focused on Chassidus, a sugya in Chassidus, and its application to life. And the rest of the talks were called sichos, and those could be anything and everything in the rage of Kol HaTorah Kula, Yiddishkeit, the Jewish people.
Wow. So you were a bacher, you lived in Crown Heights, I'm assuming.
I lived in Crown Heights, I learned in yeshiva. So during the week, there were tape recorders, obviously. It's not the Balatanya's days, so they recorded everything. And a lot of Fabrengens during the weekdays, whether it's Purim, Chanukah, Yad Kislev, just the middle of the week, Yartzites, special days, Yom Pagra. But all Shabbos and Yom Tovim, obviously, nothing was recorded. So Over the years, it was all oral scribes.
Wow. And how many chayzrim were there?
In my days, there were like 5 or 6, and
Wow.
usually it was not more than that. It was a
Wow.
very, very intense.
Very intense.
Ad hayom, I have to say, Mitzvah Shabbos, when Shabbos ends, my wife knows, there's an anxiety that sets in.
Wow.
So maybe in the beginning she thought that I'm Pashat experiencing the departure of Kedushas Shabbos, but I'm not so holy and lofty. It's Pashat because Mitzvah Shabbos, those days, those years, I went into to high gear. I would to stay up a whole Mitzvah Shabbos and Sunday night. It was incredibly hard
And you
work
wrote it down.
to put it all into writing.
Wow.
Before we wrote it down, we would first go it over. The chayzrim would come together already Shabbos afternoon, Mitzvah Shabbos, and say it over. And there would be a lot of debates and vikuchim. It was intense. Sometimes in the middle of the week, we can ask the Rebbe some questions, biksav, or give in some of the sichos for him to edit. But it was an avodah gedolah. But it was also, I felt privileged. I felt like I'm really part of history.
Wow.
When I stood there and the Rebbe spoke, and I knew that a genius like this comes around very seldom. Somebody who had such a pekiyus and amkus. He knew every pirush of the Vilna Gaon in Zohar and Mishlish Hashir, every line of Ramchal, every Tosfos, every Maram Shif, Rebbe Akiva Eiger, Kabbalah, Machshava, every Rashi and Shas, every Yerushalmi. It was just, and the combination and the unity. And he also knew a lot of the secular branches of wisdom in terms of mathematics and psychology and science and physics, cosmology, astronomy, engineering. So, you have such a personality and such a mind. I really felt privileged. I knew that if I'm not going to remember and it's not going to be recorded, it's going to be lost. And this is precious, precious material. And ad hayom hazeh, people learn it, and it inspires a world, thousands and thousands of Talmidim and Chassidim and Mekorovim. So it was really a historical privilege to be part of it.
Well, and how much of that do you think played a factor that you could give, 50, 70 different lectures a week on every kind of topic? The fact that when you were a bacher at this age, you had to absorb so many different topics, how much do you think that played a factor?
Probably I would assume that it was the decisive factor, or at least a majorly impactful factor in all of this. It's also not just the ability to retain knowledge, but it was also the approach. The Lubavitcher Rebbe really helped me cultivate in Yiddish it's called a Weltanschauung, a Hashkafas Olam, that can synthesize paradox and can appreciate the infinite broadness of Hashem's world and of Yiddishkeit. He was very not parochial, very not narrow.
My next question is going to be where you picked up your vocabulary. I'm just going to put a pin in it.
So his expansiveness, his ichbatiyut, his concern for every type of Jew. There were no labels, there was no chitzonius. It was just so inspirational, and just an approach of how to also apply Yiddishkeit in a very relevant and contemporary way. Torah is not old, it's not archaic. It's real, it deals with real issues of life. You don't have to escape the real challenges of a person's mind and a person's soul. So besides the experience in terms of the intellectual experience, it just gave me such a powerful approach and a way of thinking about people and thinking about ideas and presenting ideas. When I was a young child, an interesting story, I was standing there by the Fabrengen, and as Chatoyan in Masker Hayam, I was not listening. I was a little kid, mamish. I was counting the beams and the bricks. In the middle, I see there's a finger pointing at me. And I see this Lubavitcher Rebbe. He's from 6,000 people. He decided to point at me. And he says he wants to ask me a question. This was the last thing I wanted to happen. I was a shy kid. I'm still a shy kid. I don't know, you may not notice it, but I'm a shy kid.
I did not notice.
And he says in Yiddish, he spoke in Yiddish, Look at this, he's pointing at me, Mamash Azai, with his finger, shaking a little bit. Von wannen weißt du, as da Welt? How do you know that the universe exists? I didn't know what to say. How do I know the world exists? How does anybody know that the world exists? Nobody ever asked me such a question. Now 6,000 eyes are looking at me. I'm blushing. All I'm thinking about is, live and let live.
Yeah,
I didn't bother you. I was doing my thing. Why are you bothering? But the Rebbe was waiting for an answer, and he was quiet, maybe for 15 seconds, which seemed like
eternity.
mamash eternity. And I didn't have what to answer. So the Rebbe answered for me. He said, Entweder. This is what the child answers. And he said, Von wannen weiß ich, as da Welt? Weil der erste Posuk in Teire hebt sich an, Bereishis bara lekim es Hashemayim v'saaretz. The opening of Torah says, Hashem, in the beginning, created heaven and earth. That's how I know the world exists. When I grew up, I went to check, what was he talking about? And I noticed the Rebbe was talking about two ways of looking at the world. He was talking about Moshe and Aaron. One way of looking at the world is from the world's perspective, and one way of looking at the world is completely from the Torah's perspective. The only reason you know it exists is because Torah says, welcome to Shemaim B'Saretz. And as I grew up, and today when I reflect on it, I think that perhaps it was a shtickle empowerment, or a message, or a bracha, that you'll travel the world, and your ultimate message has to be, do you know how we know the world exists? Bereishis bara lekim es Hashemayim v'saaretz. Help people align their experiences of life with the divine vision of Bereishis bara lekim es Hashemayim v'saaretz. And that's what I try to do in one way or another way.
Wow. So let's move the story on a little bit more. You were a Chabadske Bacher, and how did it, where did it go from there?
Yeah, so you know how often people will tell you you got to go to a coach and a guru and a life coach, and they'll evaluate you and tell you what you're good at and what you're not good at, and your kishreinis and what you're supposed to do with your life. And then you'll create a plan, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and a trajectory. So this didn't happen in my life. This was not part of the plan, was not part of the tochnit, as they say. It wasn't part of the dream.
As a Bacher, you didn't know that you were going to be Rabbi YY Jacobson.
I was just doing my thing. I would sit and learn. To be able to be one of the chayzim of the Rebbe, we had to sit and learn the whole week. As a lishma.
It wasn't Sunday night after you finished writing to Miami now for the rest of the week.
But good gedacht kennen, and then he would just quote Gemaras Nachanan and Rashis and Avudrahams and Radaks and Ramaks and Arizals and you know Ramaz and Shah. You just had to sit and learn, and we often didn't know what he's talking about. Somebody usually figured it out, but so I was sitting and learning in yeshiva, and you know, life moved on. When I was in my low 20s, the Rebbe fell ill, and then 2 years later he passed away. This was 94, June 1994. Gimel Tammuz Tavshin on Dalet. So I continued learning. It was a difficult kufa for me personally and for my chavedim, obviously. I continued learning, and my father, Zechrona Levracha, was all of his life he was a journalist. His whole life. He was an interesting person. He worked for Yediot Achronot, which is Israel's largest daily newspaper. He became their correspondent in the United Nations.
United Nations.
He succeeded Elie Wiesel. Famous Elie Wiesel used to be a journalist. He gave the job to my father. They were close friends. They remained close friends. My father worked for Newsweek, for the Herald Tribune, for a Yiddish daily called the Tag Morgen Journal, the Day Morning Journal. It was a daily Yiddish. Now, these were newspapers that were read by hundreds of thousands of Jews, immigrants who spoke Yiddish. In 72, that paper closed down suddenly. The publisher, Jacobs, he couldn't afford it. Remember, the new generation in the secular Yiddishist world were in public schools. They were all speaking English. Yiddish remained only more or less in the Chassidische Welt, unless you go to Antwerp. You go to Antwerp, you could see Yidden unbared speaking Yiddish. But in America, that didn't happen. But in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, you had millions of American Jews whose language was Yiddish, even though they were secular.
Wow.
The Perlowitz had probably 250,000 readers, and it was a socialist left-wing newspaper. Tag Morgen Journal was a little more right. So my father worked for it. Everybody used to tell us that, you know, most employees were in their 70s and 80s. He was the only young man. When it closed down, he opened up his own Yiddish newspaper called the Allgemeine Journal.
That was your father.
My father in 72, the year I was born. He created it from scratch. Later it went to English. So he had a writer, an old Yiddish writer from Varsha, very famous. His name was Hillel Zeidman. The old Yiddishisten all remember Hillel Zeidman. He would write a Parsha column. He was an interesting man. A Varsha Yid, a Tayir Yid. And he passed away. My father asked me if I could write a column on the Parsha. He needed somebody, and I knew ich kann ganz a Fleisig in Yiddish, und a Russisch and Litvish in Yiddish, a Kalina Yiddish. So we grew up in a very Yiddish-speaking home. So I started to write this column, and interestingly, one day, a Rav from Chicago, a Rav Highland Park, Chicago, Rabbi Shanowitz phones me, and he says, I read your column every week. Ich hab stark hano. Come for a Shabbos to my community. Speak here. I'm like, Rabbi, I don't speak in communities. I'm a yeshiva bacher. I write for my father something on the parashah, Vertel, Akdushas Levi, Anayim Elimelech, Yismach Moishach, Sam Sofer, a Brisker. I would write nice Verte on the parashah with a Psamaisa. He's nudging me. I'll pay your ticket. I'm buying you a ticket. You'll just come and speak to my shul. Say over from your article. I said, okay, I'll do it. I came, and I guess the Olam enjoyed it. Next Shabbos, I get a call from another Rav in Great Neck. Could you come to my Kehillah?
In Great Neck, they were speaking Yiddish at the time?
Great Neck was English, Chicago was English. And I was still a yeshiva bachas. I guess Chavre Islay. And then I guess after I got married a few years later, it just started to grow, and I started to get a lot of invitations. It was really completely not planned. And people started to invite me to speak to their communities, and then to schools and yeshivas, universities, JCCs, kehillas, from various demographics of the Jewish community, and sometimes from the non-Jewish community. And it just
snowballed.
Yeah.
Well, so we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we are going to be back momentarily. Welcome back. Okay, Rabbi YY was, I guess, the Yad Hashem that you started writing for your father's paper, the Allgemeiner. Is it still around? Still around. And then you were invited to Chicago, and slowly but surely you got around. Now, from there, you've written, I know, thousands of articles, and you give shiurim all over. Now, here's the question. I chas v'shalom don't want this taken the wrong way. But by the frum community, generally in a certain sense, Chabad sticks to its own. I don't mean chas v'shalom that there's any animosity anyway, chas v'shalom. But they live in Crown Heights, and they have a certain culture between Belz, Bobiv, and the other places. They're in Borough Park. It's one big chalem. And you have people in other communities. And seldomly do we find that a rabbi from Chabad speaks to people from the mainstream, the rest of the other frum communities. And somehow I think that you managed to hit every demographic in the frum community. As we came, just FYI, Rabbi YY was in the middle of recording something in Hebrew for somebody in Israel. How is it that you managed as a Chabad rabbi to get to everybody? And it's even more than that. You manage to bring the concepts of Hasidus and the Rebbe's Sichas and the Rebbe's Maimorim, and you manage to bring that into all other parts of from and non-from Yiddishkeit. How do you think that happened?
It's an interesting question. I don't take it in the wrong way at all. In fact, I feel very privileged. I have to say sometimes, what do you say, high on the Borei Olam?
Yeah.
2020 phrase. I sometimes really feel high when I look back at the day and I said, in the morning I had a shiur in Kiryas Yoel in Monroe. Then
That's happened?
yes.
Wow.
Later in the day in Vishnitz. Later in the day in Lakewood, Yeshiva University, and then the next night at a dinner in Tells in Cleveland, and then in a completely secular community. So I really feel privileged by the fact, and I think really, I'll tell you what inspires me. There's a beautiful word from Rabbi Cheskel of Kuzmer. Rabbi Cheskel of Kuzmer, Schus Yagan Alein, was one of the great Hasidic masters in Poland. He passed away 1856, Tafresh Tazayin. He was a student of the Chayza of Lublin. He's the ancestor of the Mudgets, Chassidish Mudgets dynasty. So his Einikel brings a word that he heard from Rabbi Cheskel Kuzmer. And it really inspires me. He says, Yosef tells his brothers, after he reveals himself to them, and they're going back to bring Yaakov to Mitzrayim, he says the three famous words, Al tirgezu badorach. Literally it means, Rashi says, don't get into a fight on the road, who's guilty, who did it, vet ungerecht. Let's put it behind us and let's move on. Al tirgezu badorach. Another pshat is, don't get involved in too many pulpulim on the road because you're going to get lost, it's going to be dangerous. Reb Chatzkel of Kuzmer said, there's another meaning, Al tirgezu baderach. He says, don't get broiges on another Yid because of his derech. Yosef understood, like the brothers understood, that their argument was not just a superficial machlekes about a shirt or about a dream. There were different mahalchim in Avodas Hashem. There were different drachim, which the Sfas Emes discusses, the Balatanya discusses, a lot of Svarim discuss. There were two different mahalchim of how to serve Hashem. If the vision of Yiddishkeit is ultimately supposed to be more insulated, we have to be royet sign shepherds, or the vision of Yiddishkeit is universal. L'sakin olam b'malchus shem daled yud. It's a serious debate, and the debate goes ad hayom hazeh. Al tirgezu baderech. Don't get beroiges baderech because of the derech. You have to realize that Hashem is infinite. Hashem is Ein Sof. And Torah is infinite. And it encompasses endless diversity. Don't allow diversity to deter you, to destroy you, to confuse you, and to turn you into a tribal person who can only speak and connect to a certain shnit, a certain hat, a certain nusach, a certain shul, a certain mahalach, a certain chalois, a certain niggin, a certain geder, a certain inyan. Don't become that person. Embrace who you are with tremendous passion and gusto and oomph, but don't reduce Hashem to one finite experience. And for me that meant, in my life, it meant that if I can only speak to one demographic that looks like me, or grew up like me, or shares the same culture like me, or wears the same type of hat, or davens the same nusach, ultimately, I am not connecting to the pnimius of Yiddishkeit. I'm not connecting to the elikus. Of Chassidish Moshe, we call it the elikus, to the godliness. I'm connecting to culture, which is nice. I'm connecting to my tribe, which is fine. But if you're really in touch with the Rebbeinu Shalom, Malay Chalaretz Kleid, the Eberste can sein umetum, kannst du echt sein umetum.
Wow. You just said such a deep thing. And I'll explain to you why. As you were saying it, I was like, wow, this is really deep. Because you're saying when somebody's only my Hasidus, my Kehillah, my community, we're the ones, you're connecting to culture. You like your culture. And in order to really be able to connect on, like you said, Elikus, if you can't accept every single Yid, yeah? He's a Chabadska, beautiful. He's from Satmar, beautiful. He's in Eretz Yisrael, he's part of the Mitnachlim or whatever. Kol Zman, you follow the Shulchan Aruch, and you have one God. You're connecting with them. Wow.
And I think it's something we have to work on, frankly. Sfasema says, in Shmois, he says, Vayetze Bayom Hasheni. The first day Moshe came out and he saw anti-Semitism, an Egyptian beating a Jew. He found an Eitzah. Vayaches HaMitzri, Habala Harga, Chashkem Laharga, Harga Mavek. Vayetze Bayom Hasheni, he saw two Jews killing each other. He says, Vademet Nishkat Kenetze, he had to run away.
Wow.
He says there's two casualties of Galus. There's the casualty of anti-Semitism, and there's the casualty of inner infighting. The first one is an identifiable enemy. People hate us. We have to stand guard. The second one is a much more subtle cancer, and it erodes us from within. In Yiddish, it's called the Krumme de Naz. You know, it's the Krumme de Naz, like the Chavetz Chaim. Mach mit Naz. It's nicht eigene, it's nicht mishaluni. And he says, for that, darf man noch suchen an Eitzah. I once told my Talmidim, I said, there's a beautiful piece of Gemara in Brachos. The Mishnah asks, Me'emes HaKar Nashma Ba'arvis, and then Me'emes HaKar Nashma B'Shachris. So there's a few shittas, how you know that it's light enough to be able to say Kriyash Mashal Shachris. One of the shittas I think Acherim Moimrim is, M'sheyakeres Chaverei B'richuk Arba Amas. If my friend is 1 foot away from me, even at night, I'll recognize him. But if he's berichuk arba amas, 6-8 feet, he's out of my daled amas, and I could recognize him, then you know it's light enough to say Shema Yisrael. So I said, I think there's a deeper meaning here. Meshiyakeres chavere berichuk arba amas. You have those chevre that are part of your daled amas. You go to the mikveh with them, you drink coffee with them, you eat cholent with them, you eat sushi with them. You're part of their chabura, like you say, you're part of their culture. Then I'm not sure you could say Krishma. The one who's outside of your daled amas, you could recognize him as your chaver, you could be mechuber to him. Then you could say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad.
Wow. 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 That was very powerful, very inspirational. And I think that it's a message. Kol Zman Klal Yisrael's and Golos over here. We need that message stronger and stronger.
You know, frankly, I don't want to, and I don't mean this in a sharp chas v'shalom or judgmental way. Sometimes religion can also become somewhat egotistical. I say God, 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 Hashem, 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 abrich mein zich. My ego, I need to feel comfortable, and you're challenging me. So I'm really stuck. I'm stuck in my own small orbit. A person who doesn't look like me challenges me to transcend myself and go into a much deeper place where I can create space for you and you can create space for me. I think it's also the essence of shalom bayis, really. This is what creates marital harmony. To expect that your wife or your husband is going to agree with you about most things. Today, the most progressive research on marriage shows something interesting. They used to think the difference between a good marriage and a bad marriage is, in a bad marriage they're always fighting. In a good marriage they agree about 90% of the things. Modern research shows 69% of agreements between husbands and wives in good marriages that they had in the beginning of the marriage, they will have 60 years later. When he's 95 and she's 93, they'll still be arguing. Do we keep the window open or closed? The lights in the bedroom on, or the lamp has to go off? Do we go to milchiks or fleishiks? We go here for Pesach, here for Shabbos, and bigger arguments. The quality of a marriage is not dependent.
So we have a chance, you're saying.
It's not dependent on how many arguments, it's how you argue. Do I look at you arguing with me as a way to dismiss you, and I feel that you're betraying me, and all my life I'm busy convincing you? Or can I really create space for your position and never ever think that just because you disagree with me, you don't love me and I can't trust you? We can disagree with each other among Jews, nicht gefährlich, but we have to trust each other. We have to be able to be here for each other. We have to be able to support each other. We have to be able to lean on each other. And where do we have a better example than the whole Gemara? Talmud Bavli, thousands and thousands of pages. There's not a single Amud that is not saturated with machlokes after machlokes after machlokes about everything. Emunah, halacha, inyane yeredeya, v'na'ezeh, choshe mishpat, isurei kares, isurei misibedei shamayim, small things, big things, diet, food, history, culture, everything. Of course, halacha, but everything. Haggadah, halacha, from the greatest, from Bishami, Bishilo, Tabaye, and Rava to Rabbi Yosef, Bakiva to Rabbi Meir, to Rabbi Rabbi Ashi, v'chuli, v'chuli. It's a culture filled with arguments, and yet they love each other. And this is the ingredients of Jewish existence.
1,000%. I once heard. I forgot from who I saw that there's this fad. If anybody that's a little bit more conservative than you is a fanatic. Anybody that's a little bit more liberal than you is completely off the derech.
Yeah.
And
if we want to coexist with each other, it's the challenge today in America. What's happening in America? You know, Yosef and his brothers, Lahavdil, the tragedy begins with Layachlu Dabra L'Shalom. I don't have to agree with you, but we have to continue talking to each other and listening to each other. The moment you cut somebody off from your life, I'm not talking to you ever again. That's the moment that tragedy begins.
wow. So let me ask you, now that you said that, do you believe that there's no time that somebody should cut off ties with another Yid?
You're asking a sweeping and heavy question. I would say this. I can't say that there's no times there's no times you should cut off connection, but I say, before you make that move, make sure that every other alternative has been explored, number one. Make sure that you got advice from real people who understand the situation, who are empathetic, who are big people, they have vision, they have wisdom, and they want to see people unified. They're not part of an ego game of natzchanas. If you have explored every alternative, you have consulted people who are objective, guiding you on the issue. Number three, you really examined yourself. If this is not driven by your own traumas, by your own insecurities, by your own narcissism, by your own toxicity. And you can, with the help of real mentors, say, this is what Hashem really wants from you. If you have to face God, panim al panim, this is what He really wants from you in the depth of your heart, then perhaps it's a consideration.
I think that's the key. If you remember, whatever you're doing is for Hashem. So if you really think that Hashem wants you, but I believe that most people, when they get to there, will think, maybe Hashem really doesn't want it.
There is the situation that people are so traumatized and they're so indoctrinated. And if you're brainwashed that this person is, the Russia of the century, and if we can bury him alive, Klal Yisrael will be saved. Some people can be indoctrinated that way. And that's why you always have to be humble and remain vulnerable. And always ask the questions. Where's my thinking coming from? Is my chashiva coming from a place of broadness? Like you say, from a place of elikus? Or it's coming from a place of deep fear and insecurity? Am I somewhat in a cult? These are the courageous questions that authentic people ask themselves. What's motivating me? What's guiding me?
Wow. Right?
Especially with family, it breaks my heart. Brothers don't talk to each other. Sisters don't talk to each other. Uncles don't talk to nephews. Cousins don't talk. You don't go to chasanas. And it's usually because of money. A Yerusha from the father, or a potential Yerusha. Father's alive. But in 10 years or 20 years, 120 years, what's going to be? And look at it. So already now,
I could fight with.
People don't realize these things last generations. Cousins don't get to know each other. They can't come to each other's chasanas, bar mitzvahs, sheva brachas. It's a tragedy. It's not worth it. You have to think bigger. You have to have gadlus hamoichin. Don't become petty in life. Even if you're right and the other person is wrong. In life, don't try to be right. Try to be happy. When there's somebody you're not on speaking terms with, your soul is miserable. Don't be right. Be happy.
And I've heard you say the difference between kids and adults.
That comes from the Tzemach Tzedek. Grandson of the Balatanya writes, Torah Parshas Emer, I think. He says, why is it that children, they don't harbor grudges? Every one of our children says, Tati, I hate you. You're not coming to my birthday party. You're not my friend anymore. 10 minutes later, your best friend, especially if you give them some ice cream. Adults, they harbor grudges. Yorenlang. If we would live for centuries, we would hold on to grudges for centuries.
And oftentimes they don't even remember their original cause.
And then the children have to harbor it. And then the Einiklach, because we maintain the Messiah. By us, the Messiah is very important. My father hated you, I have to hate you and your kids. So Zog says, why is it children are less mature? We would expect children to hold on to grudges. The answer is children choose being happy over being right. And adults choose being right over being happy. Sometimes I'd rather be miserable, but I'm going to be right. And children say, I don't have time to be miserable. Life is short. We got to make the best of it. I want to be happy. I don't want to be miserable. Open your heart. Be happy. Effing of the hearts. Don't. Some of us sit with bulletproof vests, our hands around our chest, not allowing anybody to come in. And we're prisoners. We're prisoners to our own insecurities and our own wounds and our own traumas. And inside we're miserable. It's not how a Yid lives. And then you come to davening and you scream, except when it comes to make peace with my brother-in-law or with my sister-in-law.
Wow. Let's get back to Rabbi YY for a second. We went off tangent a little bit over here. Beautiful and inspirational. You have been, I don't know if the word is a pioneer, but I know, for example, you were the first rabbi that was invited to the Pentagon to speak for the chaplains of the military, I believe. And of course, we know famously last year, everybody has seen that clip, but we're going to put that clip up anyway, when the President Trump came to speak for the Jewish benefactors or donors or whatever. You went ahead and you were the one chosen to introduce him. We're going to put that clip on right now.
My dearest friends, it is my deepest honor to introduce to you at this historic moment of gratitude, as millions of God-fearing Jews turn to the President of the United States of America and say, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. And fear, Mr. President, fear not. Fear not to continue the fight for the good and the fight for the just, for God is with you. My dear friends, I present to you the leader of the free world, His Excellency, the President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump.
Givaldic, we had a clip. So you've spoken and lectured and been all over the place. Where do you think was the most impactful or biggest, they may be two separate things, the biggest or the most impactful event that you've presented at?
Well, I'll tell you, I've really come to learn that it's very hard to answer this question authentically, because there have been events. I was once in Yerushalayim. I was invited to a yeshiva that was created for teenagers who are challenged, who are struggling with Yiddishkeit. which you deal with. So I know your heart is there. And there were 10 guys there. And one of them was very antagonistic to me. He was attacking and criticizing. You're a hypocrite. You don't believe what you say. You just made a career out of this. You're going to inspire us. He was really, really tough with me. And I tried, to be very non-judgmental. The worst thing you can do is become defensive, which we become because we are weak. But really to try to tune into his soul and then connect person to person, b'nafshek shura b'nafsha. And I just spoke about, the fact that even if you're struggling with your faith in God, you must never, ever stop believing of God's faith in you. Even if you think you don't believe in God, which I'm not sure is true, but never, ever doubt that God believes in you. And it's really the Sifri. The Sifri says on the Pasuk in Hazinu, Keil emuna ve'ein avel. Literally it's translated, Hashem is a God of trustworthiness and there's no evil by him. He knows what he's doing. He's teva ha'tov la'etiv. The Sifri says, Keil emuna, incredible words, Shehemin ba'olamai ubarai. Hashem believed in his world and created it. Wow. He had to have emunah in the world. Because look at our world. I'm a shugan of Welt. Between Capitol Hill, between the right and the left. I'm a shugan of Welt. You look at yourself. I look at myself. We have so much issue, every one of us, with our traumas and stresses and anxiety. Shehemin ba'olamai ubarai. Rebbeinu Shalom believed in the world. Shehemin ba'olamai.
Wow.
So Yiddishkeit is based on emunah in Hashem, but even deeper than that. Emunah in Hashem means emunah in yourself, emunah in your world, emunah in your life, emunah in your abilities, emunah in your light, emunah in your infinity, emunah in your relationships, emunah in your potentiality to light up the world and light up your life. This is what I was talking about. And this guy was sitting and looking at me like I fell off Mars, with this cynicism. And I remember I got up and I left. And I'm thinking to myself, what a flop. This just did not work. I'm quitting this job. When something doesn't go well and you're regretting that you ever got in. Why am I doing this? What do I need this for? This dismissiveness, this cynicism, this mockery. What am I, a criminal? Why don't I just become a mechanic? I'll work in a gas station. Nobody will speak to me like this. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you do speak to your mechanic this way about other things. Around 10 or 15 years later, I get a call from somebody. He introduces himself. He says, "You remember me?" I say, "No." He says, "I'll remind you. You were once in Yerushalayim, in this place. You spoke about so-and-so. You mentioned your own struggles and how you overcame them. I was giving you a hard time. But I want you to know that speech saved me from suicide."
Wow. Wow.
I was antagonistic because I was miserable. I didn't want to live. But you were genuine. You were real. You held your ground. You were vulnerable. You were not dismissive or confrontational or judgmental. And I said, you know what? I'm going to try to give my life a second chance. And then I said to myself, Rabbi YY, you don't know what a successful speech is. Sorry. Sometimes it's geschmack, standing ovation, 5,000 people. I had that. Stand up, give you a standing ovation at 30. I can't tell you it's not geschmack. It's geschmack. For a few minutes. Plus help this me the next day doesn't help me the next day. But for those minutes, it's geschmack. But in terms of an authentic impact on people, we really don't know. We mamish don't know. So I see my job really as wherever I go, plant a seed. Plant a seed. Where the tree is going to grow, I don't know. How it's going to grow, I don't know. When it's going to grow, I don't know. What type of fruits it will have, I don't know. That's not my job. My job is have seeds and plant them. Seeds of Yerushalayim. Seeds of Avos Hashem, Avos HaTorah, Avos Yisrael. Seeds of Shehemin ba'olamai ubarai. Just plant it, plant it. But you ask, I'll talk about one memorable moment was that speech to the chaplains. It was
In the Pentagon.
It wasn't in the Pentagon, it was arranged by the Pentagon. It was in Hilton Head, South Carolina. The U.S. Army, of course, it's a huge army, and its chaplaincy is huge. These are all the spiritual ministers who are there for all the soldiers.
And not necessarily all Jewish.
Very few.
Right.
For some reason, most Jewish youngsters think that real estate is more exciting than going into the U.S. Army. For whatever reason, you'll analyze that elsewhere. So you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of troops who are not Jewish, mostly Christians, whether Catholics or Protestants, or Episcopalians, Mormons, Baptists. You have a few Jews, a few Jewish chaplains, not many. At that event, there were maybe 15 Jewish chaplains, but thousands of Christian chaplains. I think there was a few Muslim chaplains, a few Buddhist chaplains, a few Hindu chaplains, mostly Christian chaplains from the various branches of Christianity. They meet in Hilton Head, South Carolina for a week to inspire each other as a convention of chizuk in their own way.
Not like the shluchim do, but the chaplains.
Yeah, the chaplain, chief of chaplains, and really they're responsible for all the soldiers from a spiritual perspective. And this was the middle of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of casualties among the chaplains themselves because they go to the front lines with them. They have to train. And usually they always had Billy Graham, who just died last year, as the preacher. He was the top Christian preacher, Billy Graham, and he spoke. The Eberste Vierte Welt, during the first Iraqi war, Bush the father, 1991, yeah. 1991.
Before I was born.
Shevat Tovshin and Aleph, I believe, right? January 91. Norman Schwarzkopf was the commander-in-chief. A Chabad Chassid by the name of Yankel Goldstein. The only American soldier who got permission to have a long beard, Chassidish Shabbat. He's been in the army for more than 40 years.
He wrote a book?
Das gedenk ich nicht. But he was a shochan of mine growing up on Montgomery Street, and he ended up in Baghdad. It's interesting, they thought they're going to be there for months. He told me before he went, he told the Rebbe that he's going to Baghdad. So he's planning to take his Megillah and everything he needs put in Pesach. The Rebbe says, Shinish Dafen. By Purim, it meant Shinish Dafen. By Purim, it was all over. The chief
That's the opposite of the story with the Balatanya with the menorah.
Which
They told the chassid on Sukkot, when you go into the forest, take the menorah with
the
you.
Rashab, I think.
Was the Rashab?
And he lit the candles. He
right.
lit the candles, and he was saved.
Yeah. So it was the opposite, Maisa.
Yeah, he says V'snish Dafen. In any case, he was in Baghdad. The chief of chaplains was a man named Douglas Carver, a Baptist. And Douglas speaks to all the chaplains. And all were not Jews, besides Goldstein. So he turns to Goldstein, he says, who are you going to sleep with? Who are you going to share a tent with? Because usually people stick to their chevre, culture. He says, I don't have anybody. So he says, you'll be in my tent. So for 6 weeks, the Lubavitcher Chassid and the Baptist chief of chaplains
slept together in
are
a
bringing together for a good few weeks in Baghdad. 20 years later, Carver is the chief of chaplains of the whole army. He was promoted. And he's now running the conference. And he says to himself, we have Billy Graham every year. Let's get a Jew. We come from Jews. Christianity comes from Jews. Let's hear what the Jews have to say. So he calls Goldstein. He says, who's the Jewish Billy Graham? Who's the Jewish Billy Graham? So Goldstein calls me that night. He says, are you the Jewish Billy Graham? I'm like, Yankel, what are you talking about? He says, I need to know who the Jewish Billy Graham is. Can I give you smicha and make you the Jewish Billy Graham? I say, Gesundheit, but don't tell my mother-in-law. I don't want to affect him out. He says, okay, he calls Carver. He says, I have for you the Jewish Billy Graham. He gives them my name. No, he says they'll call you probably next week. They'll invite you. They're going to start the process. I thought it's going to be in a few months. They invited me 2 years ahead. I realized it's not a Jewish function. Jewish function, you get invited a few days before, at best a few months before. And it happened indeed. And it was a historic moment. For most of them, it was probably the first time they heard a Jew. those who come from New York, they're already, Micheloni. They know what a bagel and lox looks like. But those who come from Kentucky, those who come from Montana, Wyoming, most of them, they never saw such a tzira, a board mit payas.
They didn't ask to see if you had horns, right?
But it was an incredible experience, I have to tell you. I saw at that conference the power of a Jew to impact the world positively. I mamish saw with my eyes that the non-Jewish world respects Jews who respect Judaism. They're embarrassed by Jews who are embarrassed by Judaism. I have to tell you that I got the most invitations that time to come the next Sunday to their church.
Wow.
I probably got close to 100 invitations to come give the sermons at their churches on Sunday. I declined gracefully, but it was a very powerful moment. It showed me how, with the proper approach, this is a time in history when we can impact not only our own, we can have a tremendously positive moral impact on the world. L'sakin olam b'malchus shindalad yod.
Wow. But Lamaisa, for you, on your scale, saving that teenager from suicide was so much more chashuv than introducing the president at the donors event.
Kol hamakayim nefesh achas miYisrael ki'lu kiyam olam maleh. Saving a soul is saving a whole world.
Wow. So we're gonna take a very short break over here, and we are going to come right back. Welcome back. Now, we're living in unprecedented times in so many ways. Now, Rabbi YY, you took advantage of the times. You have Yeshiva Net, which you're the founder of, where you have hundreds of thousands of people listening to Yeshirim daily. You have WhatsApp groups where you have insane numbers, insane amount of people that get your clips on WhatsApp groups. How many groups do you have?
We have our own, I think, around 25 or 30 groups.
25, 30 groups,
then,
all full to capacity with 250 people per group.
Yeah, approximately. And then, but I know, those groups then send it out to their groups. So I don't know exactly how far a clip reaches. But I do know, and this was so moving, it was 2 weeks ago, and there's a lot of Eidos. I give a Tuesday morning women's class on the yeshiva.net. This is a weekly shiur on the yeshiva.net since Corona. It used to be live before Corona, and now it's on the website on the yeshiva.net. And people come on Zoom, people come on the yeshiva.net, people come on YouTube. At the end, they do questions. A woman comes on Zoom, and she introduces herself. And she says, I'm tuning in from Lebanon. Beirut,
Lebanon.
I'm like, I have students in Lebanon? She says, 2 years, I don't miss a shiur of yours. 2 years.
Wow.
Lekutei Torah from the Balatanya, Chumash, Mishnayos, Rambam, Hashkafa, Emunah, Chinuch, Chizuk. 2 years, I don't miss a class. I'm like, who are you? Me'efa nafal chayarei chazef. She says, I come from a Christian family. We're in Beirut. I said, I didn't know I have students in Beirut. She says, you have not only me.
Wow.
I'm like, what? I said, how do you find me? She says, a clip. You sent a Hanukkah clip. And somebody sent me a Hanukkah clip of yours 2 years ago. And I saw it. I was in love with this message. I said, I need more of this. And she says, I grew up in a family of faith, but I lost my faith in God. But over the last 2 years, you brought me back to God. I'm like, why did you want to come back to God? He says, I wanted to, but I couldn't. It didn't make sense. There were too many questions on Christianity. But I listened to you constantly. You gave me God again in my life. So then I said, did you know your grandmother? She says, yeah, my mother's mother happens to be Jewish. My mother's mother happens to be Jewish. My mother is a Christian. My father is a Muslim. But my mother's mother is Jewish. So at that moment I said, listen, let's continue this by email. We'll have a private conversation, which we did. At that moment, again, I realized that we never know our impact.
Wow.
It's a clip. A clip goes to a Yiddish maidel who grew up as a Christian in Beirut and now slowly coming back to her people. Okay, versteh. Like Mordechai said, we never know the impact.
Wow. So you utilize the times that we're living in for good, to be able to send a clip to a Muslim Christian woman living in Beirut, Lebanon.
Who thought she was Muslim Christian in Beirut. Yeah.
Personally, I've
wonderful person, a special person.
Wow. And personally, I've heard speeches that you've given to kids throughout COVID, to bar mitzvah bachrim, to women. Okay, those my wife have listened to men. But we are living in unprecedented times, and because of technology and the speed of everything, and of course today's days with Corona, I'm saying, and the left and the right, and we don't know who's the president right now. We do know who's the president. I don't know if he knows that he's the president, but what is your message to somebody today's days? What should be how to utilize the days for good?
I would say first and foremost 2 messages that I've been sharing with people over these months. I initiated all these programs because I realized that children are stuck at home, teenagers are stuck at home, and youth need a social life. We need friends. And the more chizuk and entertainment and inspiration we can give to that demographic, the more better, because it's vital. It's sometimes hatzalas nefashos mamash. I want you to know that we made programs for teenagers week after week, and there were weeks 400, 500 questions came in from teenagers about everything, from children, dozens or hundreds of questions. In fact, the late Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Bridges' chief rabbi, shortly before his death, which came unexpected, he got sick fast. He was initiating a new program where he wanted to engage with teenagers about their questions. So his office reached out to me, what would be the most pressing questions? So I sent him a link to the website with those programs, and here you'll have 400 questions. Rabbi Sachs will have what to talk about for a couple of months. Unfortunately, he was taken on Shabbos Vayerech of Cheshva. I would say 2 very powerful messages. One message comes from Reb Shlomo Kaliner. It's the Chakalina Chassid. Shlomo was a Talmud of Reb Aaron HaGadol of Karlin. Shlomo Kalina is Chusay Yagan Aleinu. This is brought in Beis Aaron Parshas Vayetze on the pasuk Vayivga B'Makeh. It's a special word. It says V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha. Says Rashi from the Sifri. What's b'chol levavcha? Shelo yehi libcha chaluk al hamakeh. Your heart shouldn't have a machlokes with your Rebbeinu Shalom. I was once in an airport before Corona. I was stuck. Couldn't get to my destination. I meet a Kalina Chassid from your Chevra. And he says, Lama dezagan avart for the Shlomo Kalena. Why does Rashi use the word al hamakam? Shelo yelibcha chaluk al Hashem. Hashem alekecha. What does Hashem alekecha? Al hashchina. Why al hamakam? Hamakam is a rare term to use for Hashem. Zok the helik of Shlomo Kalena. Shelo yelibcha chaluk al hamakam. Don't be in a machlekes with the space you are in life, with your position in life, with your makkah. People often sit for years and say, if I would only be in a different makkah, geographically or existentially, if I would only be married to a different person and have different kids and have a different family and a different community and different kishroinus and different money and different business and different vocation. If I would be in a different makkah, life would be wonderful. Now, Nebuch, ich bin verhackt in this makkah, quarantined on lockdown. The first you say, we have to be able to make peace with our makkah. Realize that our problems in life are not standing in the way of our success. They are the way. The makkah that I'm in, that is the place where I can flex my muscles.
Wow.
And maximize my deepest potentials. It's not easy to embrace. I always compare myself to other people. I get jealous of people who would have his kids and his house and his car and his mahalach and his disposition and his character. But that's not the reason your neshama came into the world.
And you even hear very often people saying, today's generation were worthless, or was the previous generation.
This is the makkah. You have to find your Rebbeinu Shalom. What does Hashem tell Moshe? Hamakim ashata oimed alav admas kodesh. We are all in a specific makom today. We've all been on lockdown. Not all, but many people have been on lockdown. Everybody's life changed. Everybody's life changed in one way or another. Financially, emotionally, socially, psychologically. Never mind the people who have suffered losses. Everybody's life was transformed. People lost their businesses. People lost so much of life, and it's difficult. We have to be here for each other. We have to empathize with each other. We have to feel each other's pain. But we could never, ever surrender to despair. I have to be able to say, this is the makom I'm in. This is where I could shine.
Wow.
This is where I will discover my deepest light if I tune in with courage and fearlessness and resilience to be able to face what exists in this makom.
Not in spite of the circumstances.
Because of the circumstances.
Wow.
And again, it's not an easy thing to embrace. There's pain involved, and we have to be able to grieve. But this is what Reb Shlomo taught, and he says, "Vayivga b'makom." Yaakov Avinu was running away from his father and mother. He had no shul, no community, no environment, no yitzchak.
And it just became dark in the middle of the
gave
day.
him lots of love on. He's running away from Esav. Kiba Makli has a stick. Kiva Hashemesh, the sun set. Vayivga b'makom. That's when he had to encounter the Rebbeinu Shalom, who's in this space where you are right now. That's what Yaakov Tikkun Tfilas Arvis. He took his night and he turned it into a tefillah. Tefillah Miloshin HaToifel, connection. From his darkness, he built a relationship with Hashem. He took his adversity and he turned it into a deeper relationship. It became an opportunity for unprecedented growth. So you say we're living in unprecedented times? Yes, and that's why it's an opportunity for unprecedented growth.
Wow.
That's how it is. I think another very important point to make is the Lubavitcher Rebbe would always quote his father-in-law's, one of the last talks of his father-in-law, the Rayatz. He said 5 words. Yeder Yachid is a Rabbim. Every individual is a community. What did he mean? A Yachid can't have it with a minion. There's a Yachid, there's a Rabbim. What he meant to say, there comes a generation in Jewish history where you can't look at yourself as just a small, tiny individual. You're a Yachid. That's not the case. Every Yachid has an incredible koyach of influence and leadership. Everyone in their own way. This one through his money, and this one through his mouth, and this one through his pen, and this one through his heart, and this one through his public work, and this one through his private work. In today's day, stop seeing yourself as a yachid, and stop passing the buck to leaders who are supposedly supposed to lead. No. You see a challenge, you see a problem, you see teenagers struggling, you see youths alienated or depressed. Reach out, make a difference. Don't try to save the world, but there's one person who lives on your block whom you can touch. There's one girl who you could be makarev, who you could bring over for Shabbos. There's one teenager, there's one adult, young adult, older person, younger person, man, woman, child, who you can embrace, whose neshama you can inspire. You're not a yachid, you're a rabbim. You can impact a rabbim, you can influence a rabbim. Today, every single person, every one of us, has a tremendous chus and achrayus to reach out. Be a leader. Be a leader. I know you look at yourself in the mirror and say, me? You got the wrong guy. I'm shy. I just do my daf yomi. I go to Mincha Ma'ariv and I try to make ends meet. But as Shmuel Hamavi says to Shaul, Im kotein ata beinecha, halei roish la'al fi Yisrael ata, vayim shechacha Hashem l'melech al Yisrael. In my mind, in your mind, you may see yourself as cotton. But the fact is there are people whom you can touch and only you can touch. So think big, think broad, think leadership today. Klal Yisrael needs today people who care, people who reach out. And if each one of us can cultivate such a mindset, we will never be able to appreciate the impact that we can have far beyond our immediate reach.
Wow. Wow.
You know the word from Reb Simcha Binim of Pshischa, such a powerful word. Vatishlach hamasa, right? The daughter of Pare sends out her hand. So the Gemara says in Saitin Ishtarveva Yada Amas Harbe, right? Her arm extends 40 feet, 50 feet until it reaches the table. And I want to ask you a question. If you go to a sea and you see a basket and there may be a child there, and your arm extends 50 feet, what would you do? I would run away. This is a horror scene. This is an overwhelming, dreadful scene. I'm out of here. Let somebody else take care of that basket. What are the Chazal trying to say? And the Heilige Pshischa says something beautiful. He says, Batya was doing something that was essentially beyond her reach. Her arm could not extend to that teva, not physically, mentally. There are things you can accomplish in life. There are things people tell you you're dreaming. Atabal dimyoines, atahazui, you're hallucinating. Your arm can reach till here. Your arm can't reach so far. You're going to take a Jewish kid and bring him to Hitler's home? To Adolf Hitler's home? He's going to shoot the kid and shoot you. Shaita. We often think in life, this is not practical. I have limits. Thank God she didn't think that way. She knew her job is, you do what you can. Extend your arm. And you know what happens? The Rebbeinu Shalom provides you with an invisible arm that's far beyond your imagination. And you'll save him, Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the attitude of
You'll
greatness.
Save Moshe Rabbeinu, which in turn will save Klal Yisrael. Wow.
One Gentile woman, not a Jewish woman, an Egyptian Gentile woman. The Torah tells us the story to know that the whole Moshe Rabbeinu, which means Matan Torah, Yetzias Mitzrayim, Klal Yisrael, Alts, Biz Mashiach. It's the credit of one Gentile woman.
Wow.
Who said to herself, I'm going to extend my arm. Apathy is not an option. Indifference is not going to be part of my vocabulary. I will extend my arm. You know what happens? Hashem does the rest.
Wow. Wow. Very powerful. A beautiful message. Thank you so much, Rabbi YY, for being here with us. Thank you so much for everything that you do for Klal Yisrael.
Thank you.
All of Rabbi YY Shiurim are on yeshiva.net.
The yeshiva.
The yeshiva.net for free. It's beautiful. It's mind-boggling what Rabbi YY does today's days. And it's not just for the demographic of, for the adults that are going to be donors. He extended his arm now during Corona for kids, for teenagers, for everybody. Thank you so much, Rabbi YY. You're a real inspiration. And again, yes, I'm awestruck.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.